This week I have a relatively short lecture on religion, values, and community service. Before you go through and watch this lecture, though, the first thing we're going to talk about is religion, and I'd like you to pause this, and if you haven't already, go take the faith development scale that's posted on Moodle, because I've got the coding for that in just a slide or two. So in terms of religion and faith, Fowler created these stages of religious faith that kind of work similar to Erickson's theory, where you have kind of two polar opposites. Ultimately, for Fowler, if you have positive development, you get this sense of safety in the universe and the divine. If you have negative development, you kind of develop religious distrust. So in the early stages, ages 3 to 7, you've got this intuitive versus projective stage. And here, kids are really getting their ideas about God from parents and society, and kind of fantasy and reality are all mixed up. By school age, they're in the mythic or literal stage. And here, it's all about justice and reciprocity. There's very literal interpretation of stories and kind of anthropomorphic understanding. So they're really taking kind of what the religious text says and interpreting it literally. Starting around adolescence, kids can move into the synthetic versus conventional stage. In this stage, people tend to kind of ignore any conflicts that they perceive because they see inconsistency as kind of a threat. This often happens during identity formation, and so people may do the same thing with their other identities as well. So in this synthetic conventional stage, the belief system is kind of all-encompassing for people. It's often really closely tied to their social circles, and they really don't see outside of the box. Here, the authority figure really represents their beliefs and is kind of the end-all and be-all of their religious beliefs. A lot of people get to this stage and kind of remain here. So this stage starts around adolescence but can continue all the way into adulthood. Next is individuative reflective, and this normally starts around emerging adulthood. This is where people are really kind of questioning their beliefs, and they often become kind of disillusioned because they do start to become aware of contradictions in their religious beliefs. So they may go through periods of angst and struggles and experience personal responsibility over their feelings, but ultimately this leads to really a new complexity in their faith by being able to kind of understand and overcome this perception of contradictions. Stages 5 and 6 happen relatively rarely. Stage 5 is where they're really kind of understanding the logic of religion. They kind of understand the paradox of life, and they're not stuck in a theoretical box. They can kind of take a step back in terms of religious texts and things like that. And then stage 6 is kind of enlightenment and really universal principles and universal faith. So focus on kind of service to others, less worry about day-to-day things, and instead really looking at kind of universal community and universal faith principles. So again, most people end up in either stage 3 or 4, but some people do go on to have these kind of bigger, higher order kind of thinking about faith. So if you haven't already, you should take the faith development scale. This is the scoring of the scales. If you have more blues, then you have higher faith development, so you're in stages 4 to 5. More purples, you have lower faith development, stages 2 or 3. So you can kind of go through and count how many blues and how many purples you got. In order to score yours, you can just pause this video and go back and look. So kind of thinking about, how well you think these questions fit with your own perception of faith, and whether you think your score is accurate. Okay, next, just a little bit about civic engagement. You had some readings on this as well. In terms of voting, we generally see relatively low voter turnout for emerging adults, especially compared to older adults. So around 50% of eligible voters under 30 have voted in the most recent elections. It was slightly higher in 2008. It was right around 58% in 2016, a little bit lower in 2012, but that's approximately where it is. Whereas if you look at older voters, in some age categories, you get up to 70%. So there's kind of this increase in emerging adult voters, but it's still significantly fewer than other age groups. And one of the reasons might be that we see emerging adults having kind of fewer opportunities to learn about politics and civic engagement, particularly emerging adults who have lower level of education. So emerging adults who have a college education get opportunities to be more engaged and kind of connect with future networks, and that seems to be associated with voting behavior. In terms of the reasons why younger generations do less voting, they may have less of a sense of obligation to the government, feel more kind of focused on their own individual purpose rather than this kind of collective that the government is. And part of this might come from the fact that they're very focused on kind of small personal groups, like we talked about when we talked about social networks. In terms of volunteering, there's more and more emerging adults who are volunteering. But they tend to choose causes that are kind of personally relevant or of personal interest, and they also are less likely than other generations to kind of pick one cause and follow through. Instead, they're kind of frequently changing the community service activities that they choose to engage in. So generally, community service makes adolescents and to some extent emerging adults really feel connected to society. So when they see models of adults contributing to society, they're more likely to contribute themselves. So emerging adults who do engage in community service are more likely to believe that America is a just or fair society and kind of endorse civic goals. They tend to be more likely to help people in need and attempt to improve race relations, if they feel like their teachers are fair and respectful to all students. So if they're getting those models of justice, and schools are kind of institutions where kids can learn these kinds of civic norms. So it's really important for schools to kind of teach these norms, and this can actually improve community service. So when communities in general include more trust and inclusiveness and kind of a collective mission or efficacy, emerging adults are more likely to believe kind of that America has promise and want to do service to contribute to that. And these ties to the community through service and other projects definitely have positive effects on individual health and well-being and help them feel connected to the community as a result. And one format that some of you may have experienced, one format of community service is service trips. So service trips have a big influence on college students' understandings of themselves and their commitment to volunteer service. So there's a couple of things that seem to change after college students go on service trips. One is a sense of transformation, and the service trip leading to kind of new goals and values. And what we see is that volunteerism or volunteer behavior tends to increase up to 3 months after a service trip. This is even controlling for prior experiences of volunteering. So students who go on this trip get this sense of change and transformation, do go on to change their behavior and engage in more service behavior later on. Sometimes service trips elicit feelings of sympathy from those who participate. So if they're participating and engage with underprivileged communities, they might feel sympathy for them. Sympathy only predicts increased volunteerism 1 week later, but not 3 months. And people who have done less volunteer work before the trip are more likely to feel sympathy. So sympathy seems to have kind of very short-term impacts, but kind of getting these feelings of sympathy when you engage in volunteer work doesn't lead to long-term change in behavior. Helplessness is another common response to kind of being on a service trip and helping people in need. And students who feel helpless during the trip were less likely to have previously volunteered. So if it was their first trip, they may have felt like they had less power to make a change, whereas those who had been on previous trips or done previous volunteer work really felt like the things that they were doing had the power to make a change. So that's kind of just a quick snapshot on community service and religion, and that's it for this week.